Imagine sitting in the cockpit of a small single-engine aircraft on a lovely Saturday morning, just waiting for your takeoff clearance at the runway threshold. Sounds quite lovely, doesn't it? Well, it was lovely for this father and his son until an almost fully loaded Airbus A320 barreled down on top of them. So how was this possible? Well, in order to understand what happened on this morning, and before we take a look at the aircraft and the flight crews involved, first we need to take a closer look at the setting of this event. Bordeaux Merignac Airport lies just west of the city of Bordeaux in southwestern France. It serves as an important base for airlines like easyJet, Volotea and Transavia, and even though it is far smaller than major European hubs like Paris-Charles de Gaulle or Frankfurt, it is still an international airport, handling millions of passengers every year and which offers scheduled services to destinations all across Europe. This is actually quite common within Europe, since flights within that continent relies much less on big hubs compared to the United States, for example. At the same time, Bordeaux is also the home of a thriving general aviation community. There are flight schools, local flying clubs, private aircraft and business jets, and they all share the same runways as the scheduled airline traffic does. That combination creates a very different operating environment from what you'd find at a more typical, large international airport, and it affects basically everyone that's operating there. The air traffic controllers at Bordeaux doesn't just manage the almost continuous flow of commercial arrivals and departures like their colleagues at bigger airports would do. No, they also regularly need to alternate between fast-moving passenger jets, business jets and much slower light aircraft, all of which come with very different operational standards, procedures and performance characteristics. And I haven't even mentioned that they have to switch between speaking French to the local aircraft whilst having to use English with the airliners. And this also means that the work rhythm and workload in the control tower is constantly changing throughout the day. A controller might spend one moment dealing with an Airbus that's coming into land, using an instrument approach, and the next issuing traffic information to a private pilot in a single-engine piston aircraft flying a weekend pleasure flight. But to be absolutely clear, size-wise, this still is a big airport. It has two crossing runways, 0523, which is 3,100 meters or 10,717 feet long, and runway 1129, which is a bit smaller but still adequate for many airliners at 2,415 meters or 7,923 feet. As with every other busy commercial airport, air traffic controllers at Bordeaux are responsible for a range of different tasks. They issue taxi clearances, coordinate departures, sequence arriving aircraft onto instrument approaches, monitor aircraft operating visually around the airport, and ensures that every movement on and around the runway is taking place safely. And to make all of that possible, these responsibilities are normally divided among several different controller positions, each with a clearly defined role. The ground controller, for example, is responsible for aircraft moving around the taxiways and aprons. The tower controller manages takeoffs, landings and runway occupancy, and the approach controller sequences arriving and departing traffic in the surrounding airspace, whilst other positions provides information and traffic services to aircraft that's operating under visual flight rules in the area. Now, under normal circumstances, separating these responsibilities allows each controller to focus on a specific part of the operation without becoming overwhelmed and overloaded. But at quieter airports or during periods of lighter traffic, it isn't always practical or even necessary to staff every single one of those positions individually. In those cases, controllers can combine two or more positions, which is a common practice throughout the world, and when used appropriately, it can be done perfectly safely. Now, you might think that the decision of when to combine or separate positions will be based on the number of aircraft that each controller has to work with, and that could well be the case in other airports. But in a place like Bordeaux, the different types of aircraft involved matter more than just the volume of traffic on its own. So a relatively large number of mostly similar aircraft with broadly the same approach speeds and performance are much easier to sequence and generally deal with than a smaller number of airliners, general aviation traffic and business jets that are all mixed up. And as if that all wasn't complicated enough, the aircraft maker Dassault also have some installations at Bordeaux, and the proximity of the airport to a number of civil and military test areas means that Dassault Rafales and Falcon business jets also fly in and out around this airport quite regularly. So this is why actual workload is a much better way to determine when to combine or split controller positions there, except that as metrics go, workload can be quite subjective, and slow gradual increases can therefore be easy to miss. In any case, early in the morning of December 31st, the day of this incident, Bordeaux was operating in exactly this kind of combined configuration, with a total of 3 controllers present in the tower. 2 of those had arrived around 07:30 that same morning, while the third then clocked in at around 9:45. And they had initially set things up so that one of them was simultaneously handling the tower, ground, approach and information positions, which to be clear meant all of them. This controller was known as the tower controller, and the second controller was then working as the assistant tower controller, helping out with strips and support functions, whilst the third position was a supervisor, whose job it was to just oversee the entire operation. Now, the weather on that morning was about as good as it could be in December in southwestern France. The visibility was unrestricted beneath clear blue winter skies. There were light winds, a temperature of just around 11 degrees Celsius, and runway 23 was in use for both arrivals and departures. So, from an operational standpoint, nothing about the weather or initial traffic conditions suggested that this morning would present any unusual challenges. But, as frequent viewers of this channel knows by now, plenty of incidents and accidents actually happened exactly when things like good weather allows for a bit of complacency to start creeping in. At 10:42 local time, the first of the 2 aircraft we are going to focus on today came into the picture. This was easyJet flight 8013, an Airbus A320-200 with registration Oscar Echo India November Echo, which was now initially cleared to descend down to 3,000 feet as it approached Bordeaux. It had taken off from London Gatwick earlier in that morning and was nearly full with 179 passengers on board, and there were also 2 pilots and 4 cabin crew, meaning that the total souls on board came up to 185. And its call sign on this morning was Alpine 49 Quebec Hotel. At its controls this morning sat an Italian captain, and he had roughly 9,000 hours, meaning that he was considered quite experienced. His first officer, who was operating as pilot monitoring, was a French national and had around 2,100 hours. Now, the final report doesn't really go into much details or backgrounds about these pilots because it won't really matter for what was about to happen, but it is important to know that both of these pilots were based in Bordeaux, so they were well familiar with the airport and its peculiarities. Now, as this easyJet crew continued their descent down towards Bordeaux, activity around the airport was steadily increasing, with more and more aircraft in and around its airspace. At time 10:46, the easyJet aircraft was cleared for the ILS approach into runway 23 as they descended through roughly 10,400 feet. And as they were now preparing for their arrival, aircraft throughout the control zone were beginning to call the tower controller for taxi, departures, transit clearances and flight information, steadily increasing his workload. Then, at time 10:50, the pilot of a small general aviation plane called up and reported that he was ready to taxi from the flying club parking. So the controller instructed him to initially taxi towards holding point Alpha for runway 23. This pilot was flying a Robin DR400-160, a small white and red single-engine 4-seater aircraft, which is very popular with flight clubs and flight schools around the area. And the pilot of this particular one, with registration Foxtrot Golf Tango Zulu Yankee, had rented it from the local flying club. He had, at this time, accumulated around 210 hours since getting his license in 2012, and for this particular flight, he was also bringing with him his 9-year-old son. Almost immediately after this pilot's initial exchange with the air traffic controller, another VFR flight called up with questions about activating a flight plan after departure, and at around that same time, an Air France Airbus A321 was also taxiing out towards the runway, with several other light aircraft already operating around the airport and competing for the controller's attention. So, Over the next few minutes, the controller found himself continuously switching between all of these aircraft, with each requiring very different kinds of instructions, information and support. Now, on its own, none of these tasks were especially difficult or unusual, but what was starting to become a problem was now how quickly they were arriving and how frequently the controller was forced to change mental tasks and language. On top of this, since he was combining positions and therefore dealing with traffic throughout his control zone, he had his radar scope set to a wide setting, making exact movements around the airport harder to see. One of the benefits of splitting positions would have been that each controller would have their own individual radar scope set to the most suitable scale, but this was now not the case. Now, when it comes to managing complex things, this is unfortunately not something that is being confined to the likes of air traffic controllers anymore. Now, the world is becoming more complex every single day, especially with the onslaught of AI. For example, AI has made it way easier for scammers to spin up new convincing websites, clone legitimate online stores and craft phishing pages, making them look like your home insurance website or even your online bank. And I haven't even mentioned those annoying ad trackers that keeps following you around everywhere. Now, the problem with traditional antivirus software is that it's very reactive. It only really kicks in after something has made an entrance and attacked your device, which means that your digital safety has then already been compromised. But today's sponsor, NordVPN, has just launched an ingenious solution to this. With their next-generation antivirus, you will be protected 24/7 by a proactive, cybersecurity-approved, all-in-one digital security app. It will warn you about scam websites, block trackers and stop infected files even before you download them. And this makes Nord exactly the kind of safety net that you need for everything you do online. And the best part is that it will quietly run in the background without you having to lift a finger. So to get started with this, scan this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/pilot and get 4 extra months for free when you sign up for their 2-year plan. And remember, with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, you don't risk anything by trying it out. Thank you, Nord. Now let's get back to the story. In the aftermath of this, the investigators would end up spending a lot of their time analyzing exactly these kind of things, because even though the number of aircraft in the area was never exceptionally high, the complexity of what the controller was being asked to manage was steadily increasing. Anyway, so far everything still felt well within the kind of workload Bordeaux controllers were used to, but quickly splitting the position would likely have been a good idea just around here. So the question then becomes, why didn't they? The first clue emerged not from the radio recordings, but from something much more simple: the controller's duty roster. Like I said earlier, 3 controllers were on the job that morning, but according to the official schedule, there should have been 6 of them. And had that schedule been followed, it would have meant that additional controllers would have arrived throughout the morning, which would have then allowed the control positions to be split. But for some reason, that never happened. So, why was that then? Well, it later turned out that before the shift had even begun, the tower supervisor and the other controllers that were working on that day, or were supposed to work on that day, had agreed to modify the staffing arrangement. So instead of having all 6 controllers report for duty as scheduled, the morning shift would now start and go on only with 3 controllers on duty, effectively doubling the workload for those that were there. So that was how things stood at the time this incident was getting closer, except that while the easyJet flight was on approach, the controller in the assistant position first made a toilet visit and then took a scheduled break, staying in the tower cab but not performing any duties. So the tower supervisor now assumed the assistant role on top of his supervising, and that now meant that they were down to only 2 active controllers. The man identified in the report as Controller A was now carrying the responsibility for tower, ground, approach and flight information simultaneously, with the supervisor, who was now also the assistant, busy filling in the flight strips with information about the many VFR flights around. So he wasn't paying much attention to what was actually going on the runway. Now, to be absolutely clear here, this reduction in personnel was not an authorized process, but it was both known and tolerated, ATC management knew that tower supervisors routinely reduced the number of staff actually present at their positions compared to what the roster said, but had kind of let that slide in order to avoid clashes with the controller unions. Because of this, in their later testimonies, all of the controllers involved made it clear that this kind of staffing adjustment was believed to be perfectly safe and had gradually become accepted practice, especially during quieter periods when the traffic was expected to remain light. Again, this was a Saturday, which meant that there was no military testing activity in the area, reinforcing the idea that this would work out fine, like it always had. This is exactly what we call normalization of deviance, and it would later turn out not to be limited only to the Bordeaux Tower. Instead, investigators concluded that the informal reduction of staffing reflected a much broader organizational practice that had existed within the French air navigation service provider for years, leaving management with only limited visibility into how many controllers were actually present at their workstations at any given time. Now, up until this point, none of this had caused any serious accidents, but it's likely that it had been going on in the background, quietly eating away at safety margins long before this fateful morning. Anyway, things were now starting to get quite busy, but overall, the morning continued to unfold much as the tower controller had expected. As the small Robin plane and its two occupants taxied towards holding point Alpha, the Air France Airbus A321 that I mentioned before was also taxiing out for departure from runway 23. And because the two aircraft's taxi routes briefly conflicted, the Robin pilot held short and gave way to the Air France flight, quietly setting off the chain of events leading up to the incident. The Airbus soon reached runway 23, was clear to enter and take off, and then departed normally, but its role in this story was still not over. After the Air France flight had taken off, the tower controller instructed the Robin pilot to line up and wait at the threshold of runway 23, but because the departing Airbus A321 was a much bigger aircraft, an immediate departure of the Robin would have been a really bad idea. You see, as larger aircraft start taking out lift from their wings, huge amount of air will start to try and move from the higher pressure under their wings towards the lower pressure on the top. But the only place where this movement is actually possible is at the wingtips. So this means that all bigger aircraft will leave powerful swirling vortices trailing behind their wings, and those can be very dangerous, particularly for really small general aviation planes like this Robin. Now, these vortices loses altitude and dissipate gradually and are also moved by the wind, so smaller aircraft are therefore required to wait for a few minutes after heavier departures, while that mass of air in front of them kind of calms down a bit. Now, this is normally done at the holding point, but in this case the Robin had already received the clearance to line up and wait. So the pilot now just acknowledged the controller's instruction, taxied his aircraft up on the giant white threshold markings, aligned himself with the centerline and started a timer. He knew that he would need to wait approximately 2 minutes before departing, but what he didn't know was that in the tower, as each second now passed, his aircraft became a little less prominent in the controller's mental picture. And that was because the controller had already made a small but fateful mistake. Meanwhile, the easyJet Airbus continued descending down towards Bordeaux. By time 10:53, it was about 8 nautical miles away from the runway, descending through 2,800 feet at a speed of around 170 knots. And instead of now issuing a landing clearance, the tower controller just instructed the crew to continue the approach, and they also gave them the latest wind information. At this stage, everything still seemed mostly fine. Since the small plane occupied the runway, it made sense for the controller to delay giving a landing clearance to the Airbus crew, and there was still plenty of time for the Robin to complete its wake turbulence wait, receive its takeoff clearance and get airborne well before the easyJet flight would get anywhere close to him. But almost immediately after the tower controller had given that wind information to the easyJet flight, the pace inside the tower accelerated again. This time, another VFR pilot called to activate a flight plan after departure and also requested a cruising level. And meanwhile, another aircraft needed traffic information whilst transiting the control zone. On top of this, that freshly departed Air France Airbus A321 continued climbing and therefore required further instructions, and yet another pilot simply asked for a previous radio transmission to be repeated. Again, each of these exchanges lasted only a few seconds, but together they formed an almost continuous stream of radio calls, forcing the controller to react, think and move his attention rapidly from one aircraft over to the next. And as he dealt with all of this, the Robin pilot sat patiently waiting runway 23 with his timer ticking away. But he of course expected that the controller who had told him to wait there would also know when the timing was up and soon would give him his takeoff clearance. Meanwhile, easyJet flight 8013 continued its ILS approach for runway 23, with its crew obviously aware that they hadn't received their landing clearance yet. But that alone wasn't very unusual. Now, as a side note here, usually when tower controllers delay giving a landing clearance, they also give a reason for that, in order to make sure that everyone is on the same page. But even without that, the easyJet pilots could guess that an aircraft might be taking off in front of them, or there might be something else going on the runway. So from their viewpoint, this delay simply suggested that the controller was busy and that he would come back soon to clear them to land. But there was also another issue here, something that is a little bit of a pet peeve of mine, and I haven't really mentioned that yet. You see, the reason I just said that the easyJet pilots could guess what was going on rather than knowing for sure, even though they could clearly hear every one of the transmissions, was that those other conversations were not taking place in English. Instead, almost all of the light aircraft were communicating with air traffic control in French. So, while the easyJet pilots understood that the frequency had become really busy, they couldn't follow most of what was going on, at least not both of them, since the first officer actually was French. But for the pilot in the small Robin aircraft, the situation was a bit different. As a French general aviation pilot, he had a radio telephony license, which only qualified him to speak on the radio in French. But he did speak and understand English reasonably well enough to follow all of the ongoing radio conversations, something that would come to prove quite useful soon. So sitting on the runway, he now listened as the controller continued working with one aircraft after another, but his takeoff clearance was still nowhere to be seen. Now it's important to note here that the investigators didn't identify these language barriers either a cause or even a relevant factor in what happened next. And that is something that I know many pilots in the industry, including myself, would take some issue with. I have spent more than 21 years flying into big and small airports all around Europe, and I can tell you that this sort of arrangement, where general aviation pilots speak the local language whilst we speak English, is quite common. I completely understand that this is convenient for both local controllers and pilots, but from a situational awareness perspective, it is truly horrifying. And if it was up to me, other languages than English should not be allowed in an operational radio environment on and around an international commercial airport, at least not if commercial aircraft speaking English is on the frequency. But maybe that's just me. Anyway, the easyJet captain later told investigators that although he understood very little French, he was of course acutely aware of the radio frequency being quite saturated. His first officer would also later say the same thing, even though he could obviously understand everything. But it is important to point out here that when you're working in an airline cockpit, everything is in English, and you also communicate with ATC in English. So it's not entirely certain that he was fully tuned in to all of the French discussions that were going on the frequency. But that's only me speculating here. Again, the final report didn't discuss the language aspect of the story at all. When the easyJet Airbus passed 4 nautical miles on final, the first officer wanted to call up the tower and remind him about their position, but it was now so busy on the radio that he couldn't get a word in. Back on the runway, the Robin pilot was still patiently watching his stopwatch. The 2 minutes that he needed had long ago passed, but there still was no calls for him. He would later tell the investigators that this delay didn't concern him very much. He assumed that the controller was fully aware of his position, but like the easyJet pilots, he could tell that the controller was really busy, and he assumed that he would eventually turn his attention back to him. So surely, takeoff clearance was now only moments away. what was going on in the tower then? Had the controller really forgotten about him, and if so, how? Well, remember how I said earlier that the controller had missed something? A mistake he had made just as the Robin had been cleared to enter the runway? And also how the tower assistant was busy filling out strips for VFR aircraft. Well, one of the strips that his supervisor had made was for the Robin aircraft and had been passed over to the tower controller. Now, the idea with these strips was that the controller should place the strips on a board in front of him, corresponding to where each aircraft was in their departure and arrival sequence. But crucially, when the Robin pilot lined up on the runway for departure, the controller had missed to place his corresponding strip on the white surface that represented the runway. And with that, an important part of his scan was now gone. Inside the easyJet cockpit, the crew had now reached a decision point. They were descending through approximately 500 feet and they still had not been cleared to land. The first officer later told the investigators that he briefly shifted his attention away from the flight instruments towards the runway ahead, consciously checking whether another aircraft might still be occupying the runway, and crucially, he saw nothing. That went for the captain as well, so to both him and his colleague, the runway now appeared completely clear. But how was that possible? Well, remember how I said that the Robin was white and red? Well, the red portions was only painted on the side of the aircraft and tail, so from above it would have only looked white. And since it was standing over the white threshold markings, who are also white and likely larger than the aircraft, it would have blended into the background quite well. A factor that was also made worse since the first part of runway 23 had been replaced with a lighter type of surface. Now, some of you might be asking here, didn't the easyJet have TCAS? And yeah, they did. So if the pilots would have looked down on their navigation display, they would have seen the Robin aircraft symbol there. But since they were now so low down, the oral traffic warning, which they should have received, was inhibited. It was there in yellow graphic form, but again, it would have required the pilots to look for it. And those kind of warnings are also very common since they tend to be triggered by aircraft waiting at the holding point as well. So in any case, with the coast now looking clear, the captain was getting a little bit impatient. So he instructed his first officer to ask the controller for their clearance as soon as he could get a word in. A few seconds later, the frequency briefly fell silent, but before the first officer could get the mic and key it, the tower controller called them up and cleared them to land. The first officer quickly read back that clearance and the captain continued flying the ILS approach down towards the seemingly clear runway 23, which was now only seconds away. But down on the ground, the Robin pilot now heard this landing clearance and luckily understood it, even though it was in English. But he still wasn't sure if something was definitely wrong. Maybe this aircraft was still quite far out. Unlike other smaller aircraft, the design of the DR400 didn't include a rear window, so he couldn't just turn around and look directly behind him. His aircraft did have a Garmin navigation unit, but it didn't have ADS-B in or any other way to interrogate other aircraft's positions around him, so he had simply no way to tell how close behind him the easyJet flight actually was. So he now continued assuming that the controller must be about to give him his takeoff clearance and that there was enough time for him to go and climb clear of the runway before the Airbus landed behind him. But no takeoff clearance came. Instead, the frequency remained busy with other aircraft, each one receiving instructions. So when his stopwatch had reached nearly 4 minutes, the Robin pilot finally got a gap in the frequency and said, "La Tour de Fox Yankee?" The tower controller initially responded, "Fox Yankee?" not recognizing the call sign. And with that, the Robin pilot finally understood that he had somehow been forgotten. So he spoke up again and calmly told the tower that he was still lined up on runway 23, adding that he believed that the 2 minutes he needed were now up. The effect of this call was immediate. The controller now got back his situational awareness and he immediately called the easyJet Airbus up, but he was still so startled that he initiated his call in French. "Remise de gaz, Alpine 49 Quebec Hotel, immediately go around, aircraft on runway." Inside the Airbus cockpit, the captain now reacted immediately, initiating the go-around, but an aircraft like the Airbus A320 doesn't just shift instantly from a steady descent into a brisk climb. At the moment the Airbus crew were told to go around, they were at an altitude of 373 feet, which meant that they were only 232 feet above the ground. And the aircraft then continued descending for another 10 seconds or so, getting as low as 103 feet above the ground, before the two CFM56s under the Airbus's wings had spooled up enough to get the plane climbing. At this point, the Robin pilot, who previously had wondered how far behind him that Airbus had been, first heard the rumble of jet engines getting closer and closer, and he then finally saw the giant aircraft roaring straight over his head. When the Airbus passed him and his son, it was at an altitude of 372 feet, or 178 feet above the ground, which is about 54 meters. And the Robin pilot later described looking at the retracting gear of the Airbus as it thundered away, realizing that the jet's crew had not seen him. Investigators later noted that the Robin pilot had made no immediate attempt to vacate the runway, which was a decision that was almost certainly correct. With the other aircraft so close behind, any attempt to taxi clear would easily have made this situation even more unpredictable, as if he would have moved forward, he would have been even closer to the easyJet's touchdown point. So his safest option was simply to remain exactly where he was and do what he did. Inside the easyJet cockpit, with the immediate danger now behind them, the pilots were busy flying the missed approach, concentrating on maintaining the correct pitch attitude, monitoring the aircraft's performance and complying with the published go-around procedure. Inside the control tower, the controller initially remained in his position, but now had to take a moment to compose himself and get his bearings back. Almost immediately, it then went up for him how serious of an incident this had been, so he asked to be relieved, and the tower supervisor instead assumed his role. The third controller, who had been on a break when this all happened, now stepped in and took the flight information position, and the Robin pilot used the following minutes of relative calm on the radio to do a little bit of self-assessment, to see if he could actually continue with his planned leisure flight, which he decided that, yeah, he could. And sure enough, presumably after maybe waiting a few more minutes for the wake turbulence of the passing Airbus A320, he and his son just took off and completed their flight without any further incidents. Meanwhile, the Airbus crew continued flying the missed approach procedure before being vectored back for a successful ILS approach and a landing a few minutes later. Unfortunately, nobody in either plane got injured, and neither of the two aircraft involved even sustained any damage. So, to anyone not paying full attention here, this incident might have looked similar to countless other go-arounds that happen safely every day around the world. But this one was more serious for a variety of different reasons. The incident was eventually reported, although not as quickly as it should have been, and the BEA, France's excellent air accident investigation authority, opened a formal investigation into what they saw as a very serious incident. They now had to answer the question of how this had happened, and perhaps why things like this kept happening. You see, this sequence of events was not unique to this particular story. In fact, for decades, as aviation overall has been getting safer and safer, one type of aircraft incident has instead been on the rise, and that's runway incursions. Only a few weeks after this Bordeaux incident, in February of 2023, another very similar incident happened when a FedEx flight initiated a go-around at Austin, Texas, after having been cleared to land on a runway that was still occupied by a Southwest Airlines Boeing 737. And like Bordeaux, staff and workload pressures there meant that the airport had begun to operate on more and more flawed assumptions, until two aircraft found themselves only a few seconds apart. But whilst the workload on controllers in the US is caused by long-standing staffing and other issues, the staffing issues in France seems to be more self-inflicted. You see, shockingly, in this investigation, the BEA concluded that the controller's error was only the final link in a much longer chain involving very questionable staffing practices that had gradually become the norm. BEA identified two previous instances in France alone where the combination of air traffic controller positions had played a role in serious incidents, and more worryingly, the investigators then found that air traffic management couldn't even track how many controllers actually showed up for work. It was found that French air traffic controllers would routinely just not show up when scheduled, since the tower supervisors had routinely started setting up their own parallel rosters, which enabled people to stay home when the traffic situation seemed to permit it. Now, air traffic control management had known that this was going on, but had let it slide since they wanted to keep the peace with the air traffic controller unions. Something that I personally feel is deeply ironic, given that French air traffic controllers have routinely gone on strike almost every single year during my 21 years of flying. This issue was actually found to be so bad that already back in 2014, an EASA audit had found that the French way of accounting for how many hours the controllers had worked didn't meet the reliability criteria set up for license renewal. And when the management tried to force in a system of recording presence of work via the use of access badges, this was met with strong social opposition. And in some cases, controllers were found to do something called car park U-turns, where they would just swipe in the car park and then just leave again, just to make it look like they were at work. Among other things, the BEA recommended that France's Air Navigational Service implemented an automatic nominative system to verify which controllers were actually present at their workplace and in their control positions, so that staffing on paper would no longer quietly diverge from staffing in reality. At Bordeaux, local measures were also introduced, including renewed emphasis on splitting combined positions before workload became excessive, reminders to comply with rostered staffing levels, improved event notification procedures, and a physical timer in the tower position to reduce the risk of aircraft being left waiting on the runway too long. But I think that the larger lesson here is more fundamental. This was not a story about one careless controller or one inattentive crew. No, this showed what happens when people start to prioritize convenience and therefore allow deviance to become normal, causing a system designed with multiple layers of protection to be left depending on one pilot speaking up at exactly the right moment. But let me know what you think about this, and please make sure that you have subscribed to the channel so you don't miss our next video. I'm actually right now planning for another hangout with my Patreons, and if you want to be there getting your questions answered directly by me, well then scan this QR code or go to patreon.com/join/mentorpilot. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentor Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.